All right, guys, Murph's here. And Leia is kind of lurking on the edge there. And today, we're going to talk about this. An 1891 Carcano rifle chambered in 6.5 by 52 millimeter Carcano. Now, you will note that this is not in the original format of an 1891 Carcano. If you know anything about the Carcanos, it wouldn't fit into the screen currently if this was an actual 1891 long rifle. This has been sporterized. And now, most commonly, we would consider that there would be nothing that we could glean from a sporterized rifle. Why would you even bother doing a video on it, Murph? But in this case, there's actually quite the tapestry of details and information that can be derived from this particular rifle to trace its lineage all the way to where it is that I got it. Now, where did I get this? I found this sitting on the rack at a pawn shop several years ago, and the price on it was insanely low, and they even dropped it for me with not much prompting. Of course, it's because these rifles have never been terribly popular. It's something that we'll talk about here in a moment. So I picked this rifle up because there were a couple of things about it that I just couldn't let go. This is definitely a labor of love here, and we'll talk about that more as we go. For right now, why don't we go ahead and get into history. The 1891 Carcano was Italy's entry into the smokeless powder era, replacing the Vetterli rifles that had characterized the cartridge-loaded black powder era for them. And as such, this was indicative of many features of the time. So the original 1891 Carcano had a 30-inch barrel. It would eventually begat the action that is incorporated into the Carcano would eventually begat a series of short rifles as well as carbines and all those types of things, many of which would see fighting in World War I. Now, the Carcano has some weird aspects of it that are very specific to the rifle itself, especially whenever it is that it comes to the ammunition and stuff like that. And this is not necessarily a discussion of the 6.5 by 52 millimeter Carcano cartridge. That is something that will be coming up here before too much longer. This is interesting because these rifles would see some modification over the years. The original 1891 some 1891s would get cut down in 1928. Then some would become carbines and stuff like that, getting into World War II. Now, in World War II, the Italians attempted to switch over the 7.35 millimeter Carcano cartridge. However, they never really got production off the ground before major hostilities in World War II broke out. So they would wind up limping the 7.35 along for a little while and then having to go back to the 6.5 millimeter cartridge, where the many 6.5 millimeter chambered Carcano variants, including the 1891 long rifle, would make an appearance in the fighting. Now, by 1943, Italy was more or less taken out of the conflict, and by 1945, all the rifles were rounded up and all those types of things. These rifles would continue to exist in different African holdings formerly held by Italy. They would show up in some of the Eastern European countries. Keep in mind that like 10 divisions armed with these rifles and 7.35s and all that kind of stuff did go up to fight in Eastern Europe. So the Russians would capture quite a few of these rifles and repurpose them for their purposes, distribution and all that kind of stuff to partner nations or revolutionaries all around the world, wherever it is that they felt that they needed to go. Now, in the 1950s and 1960s, these rifles would start to get surplused and they would arrive on the American market. And there was quite a bit of a disdain for these rifles, just like there was for Japanese rifles. And I wonder where a lot of that stems from. And I kind of have two theories. First off, keep in mind that in like the 1920s, 1930s, Italians were not necessarily welcomed on American shores. There's a lot of issues with Italian immigrants and all those types of things. And I think some of those pre-existing beliefs and such like that could have very well pervaded into World War II, with Italy being an enemy. So that kind of gives a place for a lot of that discontent to be parked at to begin with. In addition to that, it's kind of like with the Japanese having attacked the American homeland, like that doesn't sit well with a whole lot of people. The Japanese are now terrible, and everything that they do is terrible, and every piece of equipment that they have is also garbage. Now, the Japanese and Italians were armed in very similar manners, and they were not necessarily the peak technology of World War II, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their equipment was garbage. And while the Japanese most definitely had some pretty drastic atrocities transpire, the hate that the Carcano gets doesn't really make sense to me. And we'll talk about that more as we go through this particular rifle. But with that being the case, Arisakas and then also Carcanos got cut up quite a bit and sporterized and not necessarily kept around as these fantastic collector items or anything along those lines to anybody except those with an extreme appreciation of manufacturing and then also just vintage rifles and all those types of things. So it is not uncommon to find Carcanos that have been sporterized into something else entirely. So this wound up on somebody's kitchen table to be chopped up with some home gunsmithing and turned into a new, probably hunting rifle or something along those lines. Which that person probably eventually passed away. Their firearms collection got divvied up and sold, and then this wound up at the pawn shop where I wound up picking it up for pretty much a song. All right, guys, that's history. Why don't we go ahead and get into the features of this particular rifle? As I mentioned before, this no longer holds a 30-inch barrel. And in general, Murph, how do you know that this had a 30-inch barrel to begin with? How do you know this wasn't one of the carbines? And we'll go across that as we get there. But as we can see here, it's been cut down to about 16 inches. Something to keep in mind with this, how I know or how I suspect that this was cut down, or am okay with the idea that it was cut down from a 30-inch barrel, is that we do not have any barrel extending past the front sight post here. Which on any of the carbines, you would still have that in order to have a place to be able to lock a bayonet. Now, Murph, this could have been a carbine that somebody then like recrowned or something like that. They cut off that additional barrel so that they could have a new fresh barrel to work with. And yes, they could have. They also could have left the original length of barrel and just counterbored it, and that really wouldn't have impacted anything. But sure, that's a possibility. But other features lead me away from that opinion. Now, something else that's interesting to talk about with this barrel, Carcano rifles use gain twist rifling, which means that the rifling rate increases as the barrel length increases. And this was an issue due to the 6.5mm loading that the Italians went with. Keep in mind, the Italians were the first one to go with a 6.5mm cartridge in the military. And while a couple would wind up following suit, the 6.5s would phase out very rapidly. Italy would be one of the few countries to maintain a 6.5mm cartridge in active hostilities in World War II, Japan being the other most notable, I guess, notable aggressor. Regardless. An early issue that was found with the 6.5 by 52mm Carcano round was that in standard twist rifling, the round was unmaking itself. And a lot of that had to do with you have a long bearing surface associated with 6.5mm ammunition, especially the Italian loading, which had this very long oblong shape to the bullet. So that's a lot of contact with the rifling. That's getting a lot of centrifugal force and all that kind of stuff. And I'm no physicist by any means, but metallurgy at the time could not keep up with those type of cross-sectional forces, and the round would unmake itself as it traveled down the barrel. Going to gain twist rifling fixed this. Now, also, later advancements in metallurgy would also fix this, but the Italians never necessarily went away from gain twist rifling. Something kind of interesting and very specific to this rifle. Now, as we can see here, the stock has been massively cut down. Any of the top wood has been removed, which would have come all the way back to this rear sight. We've lost the barrel bands. We've lost the original sling swivel. We now have the screw-in type setup here at the end, the new fore end. And then we've also lost like the bayonet lug and all those types of things. This is definitely not a free-floated barrel, that's for sure. Let's go ahead and talk about this rear sight, because this rear sight is a big portion of why I know what this rifle is. Now, this rear sight is very similar to what we would have seen on the original Vetterli rifles, which being smokeless powder rounds, they had this very rainbow-like trajectory, and that this rear sight very clearly captures that with how high it sits and all those types of things. This rear sight is graduated out to 2,000 meters. Now, this is where many of your YouTubers would say, oh, well, that's a very optimistic engagement distance for a single man with a rifle, 2,000 meters with this, that's very far. And they're absolutely right, because this was not meant to engage a single man out of 2,000 meters. A single man at 500 meters with iron sights is going to be difficult to pick out in an open field, let alone if he's trying to not get shot, if he's utilizing cover and concealment and all that kind of stuff, indicative of a person who's not trying to get shot. So, 2,000 meters is not meant for single man engagements. This is meant for volley type fire. Something to keep in mind, we're talking 1891 with the design and production of this rifle of pretty much all the smokeless powder rifles going into World War I. Late 1800s, maybe early 1900s designs going into World War I. This is also prior to the recognition of how much damage and work a machine gun could do. Most countries pre-World War I really didn't have any respect for the machine gun. The British are a noteworthy example because they pretty much thought that war was going to continue to be won by the infantry and the cavalry, and they did not intermix the machine guns in with the infantry. The machine guns had their own dedicated company, similar to that, to like an artillery battery, and were kind of meant to be employed in a similar fashion, not necessarily integrated with the infantry. Now, the Germans and the Russians were the only ones to really realize what the machine gun could actually do, and they would unveil it in no short order in World War I, and everyone would start to get an appreciation. The British would become quite frustrated that cavalry charges would no longer characterize the victory at the battlefield, because as it turns out, a cavalry charge is a fantastic target for a clump of machine guns. Who knew? Now, with that being the case, prior to World War I, volley fire was something that was used in order to be able to amass long-range fires on an enemy formation, defensive position, whatever, so that you could get a similar effect to machine guns, but with more control. And this was something that everyone was more capable of understanding necessarily than the capabilities of machine gun. Already, massed fires have been a part of war. Massed rifle fire or musket fire had already been a part of warfare for a very long time. So all the implementation and, you know, the officer's aspect of being able to call out distance and control the fire and all those types of things, all that stuff already existed. Machine guns, not so much. Now, there's also a second point that goes along with that. Even with machine guns being as commonplace as they were, massed fire still had a place for two reasons. One, either to be able to augment the capabilities of your machine gun, or two, to be able to supplement the capabilities of your machine gun. So if you didn't have enough machine guns or all your machine guns were taken out, you still had some sort of ability to be able to amass fires. No different than continuing to have full automatic fire capability on an M4 carbine. The M4 is not a good machine gun, but if you put enough of them together and you don't have any other machine guns lying around, it's better than nothing. Same kind of deal with massed volley fire. Now, also what's interesting about this rear sight is that when you set this leg all the way forward, this notch is your 300 meter zero. With this closed in all the way, this is 450. And then after that, on your front sight scale, it goes up in increments of 100. The 2,000 meter front sight, or excuse me, 2,000 meter rear sight was only on the 1891 Carcano. Subsequent rifles with shorter barrels went with shorter rear sights below 2,000 meters. So this gives me a very strong indication that this was not something that was rebarreled over to a carbine or even the short rifle patterns. Now, another thing that helps out with that, or at least identifying this as an 1891, is that you also have this hexagonal receiver, which would go away. This is an early production 1891. And we further see that with the 1896 year marking on this side. So this is an 1896 produced 1891 Carcano long rifle, based off of the features that we are seeing here. Made, by the way, in Torino, Italy, which was one of the many manufacturers of Carcano rifles during World War I and later in World War II. All right, let's go ahead and come back and talk about this receiver and this bolt. First off, we have a split receiver design, similar to that as like an SMLE or a Mosin-Nagant. This is where we start to have this conversation that like, oh, well, these are not good rifles. These are not strong receivers and all those types of things. This is still a military rifle. Now, people leverage these same accusations and issues with like Mosin-Nagants. And Mosin-Nagants were very cheaply produced rifles. However, they were cheaply or simply produced because they did not have a necessarily educated workforce. Italy, in this case, didn't necessarily have the best industrial capacity, so they needed something that was very simple and refined to be able to produce at the scale necessary for a military. So, a split bridge design. The fact that this bolt is a very simple tubular design, more or less a one-piece setup where you have your striker that plugs into it. It's two lugs with your bolt working as your safety lug, just like a Mosin-Nagant. This is very simple, but it's also a very refined production process. There's not a lot of frills that are going on here, unnecessary frills. So sure, it's not as over-designed as a Gewehr 98 action, but it still worked. And it was so simplified that going into World War I, when things got hard, when things got tough, when World War I proved to not just be a meat grinder for men, but also for material, the Italians managed to still be able to maintain production because there was nothing, well, first off, there's nothing else they could really do to refine their product, but it was already as simple as it could be. All they had to do was just hit the fast button and to increase production. And they didn't have to necessarily simplify the rifle in order to increase production. Unlike other countries, when we get into World War II, there's not really a last-ditch Italian rifle, because I guess if one way of looking at it would be that they started the war with a last-ditch rifle. But when it comes to the Mausers, when it comes to the Arisakas, when it comes to Mosin Nagants, you do see late war refinements to make production more simple. This never had to go through that. All right, now go ahead and hit this real quick. Our safety is located right here. Press in. That's annoying. Okay, well, there. So you press in, bring it over. Now the weapon's on safe. And then you press in and rotate. And now the weapon is on fire. Let's go ahead and talk about this magazine system. You see here we have an exposed magazine. And this is for the Mannlicher style of clip feed, which would take this small spring steel clip. Americans have a tendency to believe that the M1 Garand was the only rifle to ever utilize some type of M-block clip loading system. They were not, and actually came up with the Mannlicher in Austro-Hungary first. And then the Italians licensed the manufacture of it as well. So, important thing, this is a clip. This holds a packet of ammunition. This is a magazine. This has the spring that is going to feed the rounds up to the bolt to be able to place in the chamber, and is where the ammunition goes. That's the difference between a magazine and a clip. A clip does not have a spring. So when you have a detachable box magazine, it has a spring inside of it. If it was a detachable box clip, it would not have a spring. Important little dynamic there to understand. So one of the interesting things about this rifle is, just like an M1 Garand, that happens. So when the last round is chambered, and I was really hoping to be able to display this. When the last round is chambered, the clip is supposed to fall out. Unlike on an M1 Garand, where when the last round is fired, the clip ejects out of the top of the receiver. Now, also unlike an M1 Garand, we have a large hole here in the bottom of the receiver that could allow things to come in. M1 Garand doesn't really have that issue. We'll talk more about this bolt and that clip here in a minute, but something else to point out here, we have a button right here located in the front of the trigger guard. This is so that you can eject a loaded clip of ammunition. Now, with this clip as well, you can load the chamber without the clip, but you cannot load the magazine on this without the clip. The clip is required for this magazine to be able to function. So if you don't have the clip, it's a single shot rifle. You can load less than 6 rounds, which is the capacity of this rifle, into the clip, but you cannot load more than 1 round without the clip. All right, let's go ahead and talk about this trigger. Okay, so we have a lot of free play coming up onto a slight amount of take up onto a wall, and then a fairly brisk break. Like, it's not a bad trigger at all by any means. All right, now, originally on 1891 Carcanos, you had a straight bolt. And as we can see here, this bolt is bent. Okay, well, is that right or is that wrong for this particular rifle? There's a couple things to keep in mind. For a lot of people, they might say, well, the easiest thing, Murph, is to go ahead and look at the serial number on the bolt. However, the Italians did not serial number every part of this rifle. They didn't consider it to be important. It's interchangeable parts anyway. Just go ahead and just have it be interchangeable parts. So this could be the original bolt that someone had the bolt handle turned down on, or this could be a later in its life adaptation where at some point the original bolt, which could likely happen, was worn out and a new bolt was placed into it, and they went with a turned down bolt because that's what all the patterns after this rifle had. Just like the barrel on this could have been replaced, though looking at it, if it was replaced, we would have lost this octagonal shape. So more than likely, this is the original barrel. All right, now the only other place that was serialized on this rifle was the stock. However, as is often the case with these rifles, It is incredibly difficult to be able to make this stuff out. I think this one might have been refinished, but just with the passage of time, lots of wear and all those types of things, I have yet to have seen serial numbers in the stock that I could actually make out. Almost looks like that might be a 7 at the end, which would not be correct for this. So this would not be the original stock if that was the case, but there's really no way to be able to tell for sure at this point. Just like there would be kind of like a disc embossment right here, that has also been more or less worn away, and that's typical for Carcano rifles. Now it looks like the original, or the person who sporterized this rifle decided to retain the original rear sling swivel, which has since disappeared. Don't know what necessarily caused that to happen, and I obviously haven't made any changes to it. And then we have a metal butt pad. What I find interesting about this rifle, this comes in at about 7.3 pounds, and it doesn't feel like it. I would have guessed around 6 pounds. It's very handy. It's very easy to be able to work around and all that kind of stuff, and I really would have guessed that it was much lighter than 7 pounds. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? Now, as I mentioned before, Carcanos do not have a good reputation. And if there's one aspect of their reputation that is most definitely not good, it's accuracy. And there's a couple of things that I think play into it. First off, these are surplus rifles. Especially if you're talking about in 1891, it possibly served in 2 world wars. This is the original barrel, but even ones that got serviced in between. A lot of World War I and World War II ammunition was corrosively primed, and in field conditions and stuff like that, they were not necessarily going to be well taken care of. Good possibility that your bore is not in good shape to begin with, let alone the fact that original 6.5 Carcano ammunition had a nominal diameter, bullet diameter, actual bullet diameter of 0.268. Current 6.5 ammunition has all been standardized around 0.264, and that includes any manufactured Carcano ammunition out there on the market. So if you want 0.268 ammunition, you have to hand load it yourself. If you're buying PPU, you're getting 0.264 diameter 6.5 Carcano ammunition. So already, if you're talking about a bore that's maybe not as mint as it could be, and then ammunition that's a little undersized, it shouldn't be a shock that you're having issues with accuracy. I've taken this rifle out to 75 yards, and I've at least been able to get the rounds on paper. There's an awful lot of people on the internet doing Carcano reviews who aren't even necessarily getting that. They're getting keyholing at 75 yards. Just one of the things that you do have to contend with this particular rifle. They could be made to shoot accurately. You're going to have to put a lot of effort in to be able to get around it. So I'll go ahead and roll in some of my targets from shooting this rifle, along with some notes. I only have PPU or similar ammunition. Everything out there is the undersized ammunition. There's really no way around it. I don't currently hand load for 6.5 Carcano. Maybe I need to start. Who knows? Now, when it comes to shooting and all that kind of stuff, the rifle's recoil is mild. This is only a little bit longer than a 7.62, and it's still a full power rifle cartridge, but it's a very mild recoiling cartridge. It's very pleasant to shoot. It's not something that necessarily like beats you up like perhaps an 8mm Mauser or a 30-06 or something along those lines. I really enjoy shooting the 6.5 Carcano. Now let's talk about this bolt. This bolt, we can go ahead and decock it so we get the full. This bolt is stiff. Let alone trying to run it off of my shoulder. I have to really like twist and engage my forearm a lot and all that kind of stuff in order to be able to run this efficiently. To me, it feels a lot like a Mosin Nagant bolt, which previously I have described the Mosin Nagant bolt as feeling like I'm working with like rubber bands, like bound up rubber bands. Same kind of feeling here. We will note that it's a cock on open action. I think I forgot to mention that before, but so the bolt's definitely a little stiff, but there's nothing more irritating than trying to get this clip to feed in here. Sometimes this clip is a real pain to get into the action. And something to keep in mind with these clips is that these were not meant to be reusable. This was issued with the ammunition loaded into it in little, the little containers and stuff like that that the Italian military packaged them in. Got issued out to the troops. They put them in their bandoliers. They loaded them in their rifles. They dumped them on the battlefield. They never saw them again. That was how these were supposed to be used. So it's not a surprise to me that this clip is irritating. It's just an unfortunate byproduct of dealing with these types of rifles. So this can definitely be a gummy, difficult rifle to work with. It's just the nature of the game. All right, guys. That's shooting. What are my recommendations when it comes to this particular rifle? Would I recommend this as a duty type rifle? Absolutely not. Not even a little bit. Only if there was a fire. This does not have the ability to be able to mount optics or lights or anything along those lines. The action is finicky whenever it comes to loading the clips and stuff like that, because you're probably not, there might be someone out there producing new made clips for these things, but if you're running off of old surplus clips, good luck. The ammunition's expensive, difficult to come by, and just overall, there's nothing about the performance of this rifle that makes me go, yes, that's what I want to fight with, as opposed to any other modern fighting option. So I would not recommend this for duty type use. What about like home defense, self-defense? I would only recommend this for home defense or self-defense if you had nothing else, or if you could not get access to anything else. So if you're in a restrictive state, sure, this is better than a sharp stick. If you're in a non-restrictive state, I would encourage you to get something better. The only thing that makes this a viable option is the fact that I paid just over $100 for it. However, if your choice was this or High Point, I'd actually probably direct you to the High Point. The ammunition is going to be cheaper. Getting magazines is going to be easier, cheaper. Holsters, all the things that you need to be able to like use a High Point are going to be more accessible than this. It kind of hurts my soul to say that a little bit, but that is the reality of the matter. So I would not recommend this to somebody who's on a budget, because the ammunition is not going to support it long term. Okay, well, what about as a competition rifle? Well, of course, if we're talking about like, 2-gun, 3-gun, absolutely not. This rifle is not even slightly competitive. And the purpose of this discussion is whether or not it's competitive, not whether or not you're looking to like just run something for fun. If you're actually looking to try to win, this is not the thing. What about for like European military surplus sport shooting competitions in like Canada and Australia, the UK, and all that kind of stuff? Those do have limited or unlimited divisions where you can bring in rifles with some modification. Still no. Because from a competitive standpoint, this bolt's gummy. And then also from accuracy, you'd have to be like hand loading your own ammunition at that point. So I'm not entirely sure what the rules are that govern those type of competitions, but I would not take this into that type of competition and expect to do well. If I had some hand loads lying around and could get better accuracy out of it, maybe my opinion would change. But based off of what I've been able to achieve with the rifle, no, you're probably better off going with like a Mauser or something along those lines. Okay. Well, what about as a hunting rifle? Now, that's where I think this rifle would actually excel. If you were talking about very close brush hunting, very dense foliage and stuff like that, where shots are already going to be close. So basically, I'm saying using this like an even shorter range 30-30. Then that makes sense to me at this point. You can stick with the iron sights. You can do stuff with the 30-30. You know, you can engage with this in a very similar manner with 30-30. You can hunt anything that you would hunt with a 30-30, which when you're talking about hunting with a 30-30 at close range, you can take about anything in North America. So I could see that being used for this purpose. Pigs, deer especially, and then maybe elk and like moose if we're being very specific about bullet selection and shot placement and the range at which we're engaging at. This rifle should be able to deliver for those types of purposes. Okay, well, what about as a woods gun? Well, of course, as I generally say, if I was hiking, I wouldn't necessarily take this with me. But if you were looking for something that you could throw across, you know, an ATV or UTV or whatever type of vehicle and not necessarily be that worried about it, it pains me to recommend anything that puts this rifle into any more punishment other than what it has already taken. As much as that pains me, that does get to the utilitarian purpose that this rifle has now come to serve. And yes, taking this out to be able to utilize for those type of purposes, to be able to, you know, defend yourself from a predator. Bear shows up at the ranges that you might be fighting with a bear, this would definitely do the work. You know, or you wind up running into somebody of the two-legged variety of predator. You could definitely still handle them with this rifle, though there's better options available. All right, what are my uses for this rifle? Well, guys, I got to tell you that the thing that attracted me about this rifle, first off, incredibly cheap, but second off, the markings and the fact that this rifle has existed in 3 different centuries now. And that is fascinating to me. And originally, I had an idea of going to custom firearms person and like maybe having a Picatinny rail mounted right here in place of the rear sight and popping like a red dot on there and like really bringing this thing into the 21st century. I have since dropped that idea. One, because it would probably be pretty expensive. I never actually like fully looked into it, but it probably wouldn't be cheap. And then 2, because what interested me about this rifle and what continues to interest me about this rifle is that I can look at this thing and see the story. And often in military surplus rifles, we say don't buy the story. Look at the value of the rifle. Don't get caught up in the fact that, you know, so-and-so's grandfather picked this up off a dead Japanese that he just bayoneted and, you know, at Guadalcanal or something along those lines. Don't buy it for that. This thing's features and the transitions it's gone through, that's what I find interesting. That is what keeps this rifle in my collection. In addition to the fact that I probably wouldn't be able to recoup my costs if I did try to sell it. But as much as I like the practical options in my collection, I also like the history aspects of my collection. My collection in many ways is both a personal, but then also a world museum. And I like being able to bring people into my gun room and be able to discuss the implications of the many different features and aspects of this rifle and how they transcend history and how this rifle still has a notable part in history, even if all of its value has been stripped away with it by somebody's saw on their kitchen counter. As much as that's unfortunate, there's still life in this gun. All right, guys, what are competitive offerings? And it's interesting to talk about competitive offerings whenever it is that we're discussing sporterized military surplus rifles. But if I were to go by classifications, and if you're looking for something that would still retain a lot of its heart and soul, well, not necessarily its value, Arisakas I've seen a lot of Sporterized Arisakas, and I've seen a lot of relatively inexpensive Sporterized Arisakas that you would still be able to trace their lineage and their features and all that kind of stuff to be able to identify what year they came out in, and then from there extrapolate the things that they might have seen and all that kind of stuff. So that would be a direction to go. But if you're looking for the more practical side of things, then Sporterized Argentine Mausers, which have Mauser bolts, so good, strong, durable lockups, and you'll frequently find rechambered into other cartridges, which makes them very interesting because now, instead of being stuck with a 6.5 Carcano or a 6.5 Japanese that is difficult to find, possibly difficult to be able to find, like good hunting loads and all that kind of stuff, you could have it rechambered into 30-06 or something along those lines that is available. And you can find lots of ammunition for, and you can actually get a lot more utility out of as a hunting option. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.